All right, so where we stopped at last week was with this grazing resistance slide. And we had been talking about plant physiology, and so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how plants have evolved to survive intensive bouts of grazing. And really, that can happen one of two ways, either through avoidance or through tolerance. Avoidance mechanisms that plants have developed are either morphological, so things that are associated with their structure, or they're biochemical, so a compound that the plant actually produces to get animals to not graze them. Grazing or plants have also developed tolerance characteristics, and those can be in the form of morphological, again, structure, or physiological characteristics. So we're going to talk about a few of these as we talk about the ability of a plant to survive the grazing bout. So we briefly went over this graph from last week that is in Dr. Holacek's book. And so the way that this graph is set up is grazing intensity is on the bottom. So very minimal grazing is over here towards the left-hand side. And as you increase grazing intensity, it moves towards the right. And then we're looking at, on the y-axis, the production of the plant. So 0 is our baseline. If they have decreased production, that's going to be down, and then increased production is going to be up. And so the three curves really refer to how a plant is going to respond relative to different types of grazing. So curve C here is when we graze at low to intermediate levels. So here's our grazing intensity right here. It's at low to intermediate. And this really shows that grasses and grass-like plants like our sedges and rushes are highly favored by grazing. So growth is actually stimulated in the plant if they're grazed at a moderate to low level. However, if lines A and B show a little bit more of a negative viewpoint of grazing, and as grazing intensity increases, then the plant's ability to recover from that grazing intensity slowly decreases. So this table really shows us some of the major differences from a morphological standpoint and a physiological standpoint of grasses. So we've got heavy grazing versus light to moderate grazing. When it comes to photosynthesis, heavy grazing will decrease the plant's total ability of photosynthetic activity because you're removing plant area, therefore you're removing areas that photosynthesis can actually take place. The second row here, or second row, really has to do with carbohydrate and storage production. So with heavy grazing, you can decrease carbohydrate production, and you can decrease the plant's ability to store those non-structural carbohydrates. However, if you graze at a light to moderate level, you can actually increase the production and storage capability of the plant, because that is going to result in increased tillering or increased growth of individual blades of grasses. Root growth is going to decrease with heavy grazing, and it will stay moderate with light to moderate grazing. So root growth really isn't affected very much, especially in the perennial grasses, until you get over 50% of leaf removal. And then with light to moderate grazing, we can also decrease the shading of neighboring plants. So with heavy grazing, you can see a decrease in seed production because, again, you're removing leaf material, less photosynthetic activity, less ability for that plant to produce seeds. However, with light to moderate grazing, transcription losses are going to be much less. So because you're leaving plant material intact. So when all is said and done, heavy grazing really decreases the ability of the plant to compete with its neighbors. So heavy grazing is an area that we have to be careful with if we're trying to prevent invasive weeds. And then we can see increased growth of favorable grasses if we graze moderate to light levels. So when it comes to grazing resistance, the different types of rangeland plants have different resistances. So first of all, our grasses are going to be the most resistant. They're going to have the best ability to come back out of an intensive grazing bout. Shrubs have intermediate resistance to grazing. However, the least resistant is forbs. And so this is a really important concept for California ranching because we have a lot of forbs in our annual grasslands. Therefore, you really can't hammer those forbs when they come on in March and April because you can actually decrease their production to seed out, and then you won't have that forb growth the next year. So back to the first slide that we began with, avoidance or tolerance. When it comes to resistance of grazing, some plants have actually evolved to either have morphological or structure changes or biochemical characteristics, and that is indicative of avoidance behavior. So physical characteristics or morphological characteristics can be things that we see like in star thistle with the thorns and rose bushes and mesquite trees. So they produce a really kind of nasty sharp thorn. Animals are not going to want to graze, therefore they're going to avoid that plant. And then tolerance really has to do with plants that have evolved with either physiological or morphological characteristics. So the ability of a plant to come back after a grazing bout, the efficiency of that plant during the photosynthesis process, that's all physiological characteristics. So when we're talking about shrubs specifically, shrubs have really developed a series of spines and thorns which are morphological characteristics. They also develop secondary compounds such as really nasty volatile oils, tannins, and terpenes. And those really make the plant very bitter. And if consumed in a really large quantity, a lot of them have detrimental effects to brain tissue. In addition, shrubs have also developed over time to have a really intensive webbing branch pattern. And this creates lots of barriers for grazing to take place. So that's why cattle are very poor grazers when trying to control shrubs, but goats and sheep are better because they have smaller noses or smaller mouths. So their prehension mechanisms are a lot more efficient with goats when it comes to grazing on shrubs. And just keep in mind that with shrubs, the growth that was present the previous year is very rarely palatable. And even if it is palatable, it's very, very low in nutrient quality. So switching gears, talking more about grasses, some of the characteristics that have resulted in grasses being very high or having high resistance to grazing are the proportion of non-flowering tillers. So each grass has tillers that branch out from the root base, and the ability of those tillers to come back after grazing bouts really has lent itself to grasses having really high tolerance for grazing. In addition, grasses will have greater bud delay in the elevation of the apical bud. So as a plant tissue is added to a leaf on a grass blade, it's actually creating new growth at the base or the apical bud and pushing old growth to the top. So as an animal comes in and eats it, it's actually eating older growth. And even though it's working back towards the apical bud, usually the bud is not destroyed in that process, so it can continue to grow. And then let's talk about forbs very quickly. So forbs tend to be annuals. Some of them will be perennials. The ones that we deal with in California are annuals for the most part, and they are going to produce large numbers of viable seeds. So our invasive forbs like star thistle, they have the ability to put out a lot of seed very quickly because not a lot of grazing takes place on them if you're not strategically managing for it. But other forbs such as fillory and vetch that produce the very pretty purple flowers and white flowers in the spring, you have to make sure that you don't graze them too hard so they do have the ability to seed out and create that seed bed for the next year. And forbs have also developed toxins and chemical compounds that can reduce the palatability of the plant. So leafy spurge, um, as well as milk thistle, both have toxins associated with them. So you just can't allow animals to eat them in a large quantity. So if you have a pasture or a field that has a lot of a chemical or a toxic plant, you need to really graze that pretty carefully. All right, so all of these things that we've talked about in the plant physiology section really are leading us to three main management principles. First of all, the primary goal of grazing management is to maximize the photosynthetic activity with controlled defoliation. So controlled defoliation is just a really fancy way to say controlled grazing. So you are, as the manager, are actually managing how much leaf area is taken by the animal before moving those animals out. Secondly, grazing effects really depends on four major characteristics. Intensity, so how often you or how intense you graze a section or a pasture, so that could be total number of areas or length of time. Timing refers to when you are grazing, whether it's in the fall, summer, or spring. Frequency of defoliation means how often you come back to that same pasture, and then the palatability of the surrounding plants. If you have invasive plants that are not palatable in high quantities, and you have very little plants um, that are beneficial, the animals tend to focus on eating those plants and avoiding the invasives. So that just creates a vector basically for those grasses to not come back. And then finally, it's really important from a management perspective to make sure that you have adequate vegetation residue left to go back to, because that's going to do a couple of things. It's going to, in California, in our Mediterranean system, it will actually provide residual dry matter to go back to in the fall, and it will also help create cover over the soil to help germination take place the following growing season. All right, so that is the end of the plant physiology lecture, and we will get into ecology and succession next.